She was dragged out of the only home she'd ever known by her own father, who no longer recognized her. Homeless, heartbroken, and holding her feverish son in her arms, Grace thought she'd lost everything. But when a stranger in a tailored coat stopped to offer her a ride, she had no idea he held the key to the past she'd been forced to leave behind, and a future she never dared to imagine. The rain hadn't stopped for hours. It drummed steadily on the roof of the old Carter house, echoing through the thin walls like a slow, mournful heartbeat. Inside, Grace stood barefoot in the narrow hallway, her back pressed to the door of her childhood bedroom, holding her 4-year-old son, Eli, tightly against her chest. Her father, Thomas, paced the living room like a stranger. His once warm eyes, now clouded by confusion and bitterness, flicked toward her with suspicion every time she moved. His graying beard was unkempt, his clothes mismatched, and his words, when he spoke, were sharp, erratic, and full of disbelief. "You're not my daughter," he hissed, gesturing violently. "And that child doesn't belong here." Grace flinched. She had heard those words before, but tonight they hit different, colder, final. "Daddy," she said softly, trying to meet his eyes. "Please, it's me. It's Grace. Eli is your grandson. You used to hold him when he was a baby. He would fall asleep on your chest, remember?" But he didn't. The car accident had taken more than just his memory. It had taken his trust, his kindness, and worst of all, his sense of connection to the people who once mattered most. Ever since the brain injury, his mind worked in broken, shifting fragments, some days clearer than others, but lately the darkness was winning. From the corner of the room, her father's new legal guardian, his cousin Paul, stood with arms folded, a smug satisfaction tugging at the corner of his mouth. "This can't go on," Paul said coldly. "You've been trespassing here for months, squatting in a house that's no longer yours." Grace turned to him, fury and heartbreak colliding behind her eyes. "This is my home. I grew up here. My mother's ashes are in the garden. I take care of him, of Dad, when no one else will." Paul gave a dry laugh. "He doesn't even recognize you. You're not his responsibility anymore. And this house belongs to him, which means it belongs to me now." The knock on the door came just seconds later, sharp, deliberate. 2 officers stood in the rain. "We've received a formal complaint," one of them said gently, glancing down at the shivering boy in her arms. "We're going to have to ask you to leave the premises." Grace's breath caught. "You're throwing us out? Into this storm? I have nowhere to go. He's sick." "Ma'am, I'm sorry," the officer said, lowering his voice, "but the order is legal. You have 10 minutes, she didn't argue. What would have been the point? She turned back toward the bedroom and quickly packed what little she could. A small backpack, Eli's favorite stuffed bear, a tattered photo of her mother, and a threadbare coat. Eli coughed against her shoulder as she zipped the bag shut with trembling hands. Thomas watched her go from his chair, eyes hollow, unmoving. No flicker of recognition, no protest, just silence. Grace paused at the doorway, rain already seeping through the screen. "Goodbye, Daddy," she whispered. Then she stepped into the storm, her son clutched close, her world in a bag, and her home dissolving behind her like a memory she couldn't stop forgetting. The shelter smelled like disinfectant and overcooked rice. The air was heavy with exhaustion, with unspoken stories that hovered between the beds and sagging mattresses. Grace sat on the edge of a cot in the corner of the shared room, holding Eli close as he coughed softly into her shoulder. His skin was warm, too warm, and she pressed her lips to his forehead. Fever. Again. 3 other women shared the room. None of them spoke much. Everyone had seen too much or lost too much to bother with small talk. They gave each other the kind of space that only pain teaches. Grace had been here for 4 nights now. The rules were strict. Curfew at 9 p.m., lights out at 10, Conano. No food in rooms, no men allowed. You had to sign your name every morning to keep your spot, or it was given to the next person on the list. Every hour was a negotiation between survival and dignity. Eli stirred and curled into her chest, his thumb slipping into his mouth. "We'll get out of here soon," she whispered more to herself than to him. "Just a few more days, okay, baby?" But she didn't believe it. That morning, she had gone to a local diner to ask for a job. Anything. Dishes, hostess, part-time waitress. The manager had glanced at her wrinkled clothes and tired eyes, then shook his head without looking up again. She'd tried the gas station across the street, too, but the man behind the counter said they only hired people with reliable addresses. You can't keep a schedule if you don't know where you're sleeping next, he had said, not unkindly. She didn't argue. She simply turned and walked out, clutching the frayed strap of her bag tighter. Later that afternoon, she visited the small legal aid office where she had filed paperwork for temporary guardianship of her father, hoping it might grant her a chance to challenge the forced eviction. But the woman behind the desk shook her head with the kind of numb sympathy Grace had come to hate. "I'm sorry," the clerk had said. "Without power of attorney or medical proof that your father would have wanted you in the home, the courts will side with the current legal guardian." Grace had nodded politely and walked out of the building, but inside she was screaming. Back in the shelter, she wiped Eli's nose with the sleeve of her sweatshirt and rocked him gently. Outside the window, the rain had stopped, but the world still looked gray, like it couldn't make up its mind between storm and sun. A part of her wished it would just break open and flood everything, wash all of this away. One of the other women in the room, a tall girl with deep laugh lines etched into a face too young to wear them, sat on the floor folding tiny onesies. "How long you been with the little one?" she asked suddenly. Grace looked up, startled. "Since he was born. 4 years. No family." Grace hesitated, then shook her head. "Not anymore." The girl nodded. "Same." There was nothing more to say. They didn't need details. Trauma recognized trauma. That night, as the shelter lights flickered and dimmed, Grace lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her son's breath was warm against her ribs, his small fingers tangled in her sweatshirt. She knew she couldn't stay here much longer. Eli needed medicine, real food, stability. She needed answers. A plan, a way to take back control of her life. She thought of her father, his blank stare, the way he'd looked right through her like she was a ghost. And she thought of the man he used to be, the one who built her a swing in the backyard, who taught her how to ride a bike, who once told her she was made of fire. What had happened to that man? And what would it take to bring any piece of him back? The answer didn't come that night, but someone else would, very soon. And he would not be what she expected. Grace sat on the splintered bench outside the community clinic, her arms wrapped tightly around Eli as he slept against her chest. His fever hadn't gone down, and the shelter nurse had told her it was probably viral, which didn't help at all. She had waited in the clinic lobby for nearly 3 hours before the receptionist gently informed her the doctor had to leave for an emergency delivery. The next appointment was 3 days away. 3 days. She tried not to cry in public anymore. It made people uncomfortable. It made her feel exposed. But tonight, under the pale glow of a flickering street lamp, with her son hot and whimpering in his sleep, her eyes burned and her throat ached from holding it all in. The parking lot in front of the clinic was mostly empty. A black SUV pulled in and stopped near the entrance. The door opened, and a tall man in a navy overcoat stepped out, glancing briefly at his phone. He looked expensive, sharp, like he belonged on the cover of a business magazine, not outside a clinic after 9 p.m. Grace watched him out of the corner of her eye. He looked vaguely familiar, though she couldn't place where she'd seen him before. He was talking on the phone now, pacing slightly near the entrance. She stood slowly, thinking she might ask if he had any Tylenol in his car. Something. Anything. But Eli stirred and she froze, holding him tighter. The movement must have caught the man's attention, because he turned and looked directly at her. Their eyes met. For a second, he hesitated. Then he ended the call and took a few cautious steps toward her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice warm but careful. Grace nodded quickly. "We're fine. Just waiting." He looked at Eli, then back at her. "He's sick?" She hesitated. She didn't want pity, but she didn't have the strength to lie either. "Fever. Can't get a doctor to see him till Friday." The man looked at his car, then back at her. "Do you have a ride?" Grace shifted her weight. "We walked." "In this weather?" he asked, frowning. Then he took a slow step forward. "Look, I'm not a creep, I swear. My name's Aaron Whitmore. I run the Whitmore Foundation. We fund this clinic. I just came by to check in on the night staff." Her breath caught. Whitmore. Of course, that's where she'd seen him. Billboards, business articles. He was one of those quiet billionaires that didn't chase fame, but couldn't fully avoid it. "I'm Grace," she said quietly, "and this is Eli." Aaron crouched slightly to meet Eli's face. "Hi, Eli," he said softly, though the boy remained asleep. He looked up at her. Let me help you. I'll drive you somewhere safe. A warm place, please. Grace hesitated. She had been warned about people like this. Rich men with savior complexes, strangers with perfect smiles, but there was something in his voice. Calm, grounded. He didn't rush her, didn't pressure. She looked down at Eli, burning up in her arms. Finally, she nodded. Aaron opened the back door of his SUV and gently helped her settle Eli in, wrapping the boy in a fleece blanket he had in the back seat. She climbed in beside him, clutching his tiny hand. As they pulled out of the lot, Grace murmured, "Thank you. I don't usually accept rides from strangers." Aaron glanced at her. "Then I guess I'll just have to earn your trust." They rode in silence for a moment before she added, "I used to live with my dad, until he forgot who I was." Aaron didn't speak at first. Then he said, "Thomas Carter?" Grace blinked in shock. "You knew him?" Aaron nodded slowly. "A long time ago, he worked with my father. He used to bring you to meetings sometimes when you were little. You had this loud laugh, the kind that made people look over their shoulders and smile." Her breath caught in her throat. "No one's remembered that in years," she whispered. Aaron's voice was soft. "Some people shouldn't be forgotten." Grace turned toward the window, eyes stinging. She didn't know where they were going yet, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel entirely lost. Aaron's apartment wasn't what Grace had expected. When she thought billionaire CEO, she pictured glass walls, cold marble, and spotless designer furniture. But his home was quiet, warm, and lived in. Shelves filled with old books lined one wall, and there was a faint scent of cedar and coffee in the air. A soft jazz record played low in the background, and the lighting was gentle, not blinding. He unlocked the door and stepped aside, letting Grace carry Eli in. The boy was still asleep, his fever finally beginning to break after the ride. She looked down at him and whispered, "You're okay, sweetheart. Just rest." Aaron led her to a guest bedroom, cozy with a neutral quilt and plush pillows, and helped her lay Eli down. He offered her a clean towel, water, and a white cotton t-shirt to change into. "You'll feel better out of those wet clothes," he said gently. "I'll give you privacy." Grace hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Thank you." In the bathroom, she caught her reflection in the mirror. Her hair was damp and tangled, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but there was something else in her face, something she hadn't seen in a long time, a flicker of safety, maybe even hope. She changed quickly, rinsed her face, and padded back to the living room. Aaron was sitting on the couch with a cup of tea waiting for her, along with a plate of toast and fruit. She hadn't eaten in nearly 20 hours. Her stomach cramped just from the smell. "You didn't have to do all this," she said, lowering herself slowly into the chair across from him. "I wanted to," he replied. "You needed someone." Grace stared at him for a moment, trying to read him. There was something steady in the way he looked at her. No pity, no calculation, just presence. "You knew my dad," she said quietly. "Really?" Aaron nodded. "Back when I was fresh out of business school, he helped me negotiate my first serious contract. He wasn't like other men in the room. He had a moral compass, didn't raise his voice unless someone lied. And he talked about you like the sun rose and set around you." Grace blinked. Her throat tightened. "He was different then," she said. "He used to call me Bug. He'd make up bedtime stories every night, silly ones. After the accident, it all just unraveled." Aaron leaned back. "I heard about the crash. I wanted to reach out, but your father disappeared. No phone, no email. And now, I'm sorry for what you're going through. Truly." She looked down at her tea, then back up. "He doesn't remember me, not really. Some days he just stares. Other days he shouts. He thinks I'm stealing from him. Paul, his cousin, took over everything. He kicked me out, said I was trespassing in my own home." Aaron's jaw tightened slightly. "That explains the court papers I saw." She raised an eyebrow. "You've seen them?" He nodded. "I have friends in legal aid. One of them mentioned the Carter case, said it was wrong but hard to fight." Grace gave a dry laugh. "Yeah, that about sums it up." There was a long pause. Then Aaron said something she didn't expect. "Let me help you fight it." She blinked. "What?" "I have resources, attorneys, people who care about doing the right thing. You shouldn't have to face this alone." Grace swallowed hard. Why would you do that? You don't even know me. Aaron looked at her with something unreadable in his eyes. Because when I was 7, my mother left my father and had nowhere to go. She lived in a stranger's basement with me for 3 weeks. One man helped her back on her feet. That's the only reason I'm here today. He leaned forward slightly. I don't forget people who remind me of her. Grace didn't respond at first. Emotion caught in her throat, too big to swallow. Finally, she nodded slowly. Okay. And in that small word, for the first time in years, she handed someone a piece of her burden. Neither of them knew it yet, but it would be the beginning of everything changing. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the apartment windows in thin golden lines. Grace woke slowly, momentarily forgetting where she was. For a few seconds, she expected to hear the creak of the old hallway outside her childhood bedroom, her father's voice in the kitchen, the scent of burnt toast. But when she opened her eyes, she saw a strange ceiling and remembered. Eli was sleeping beside her in a guest bed, and she was in the apartment of a man she had met less than 24 hours ago. Still, it felt safe. She turned to check on Eli. His fever had broken. His cheeks were flushed, but his breathing was steady and soft. She touched his forehead gently, whispering, "You're okay, baby. You're okay now." She slipped out of bed and padded quietly to the kitchen. The apartment was empty, but a note on the counter waited for her, written in clean block letters. Had to step out for a meeting. Coffee's fresh. Take your time. She smiled despite herself. Coffee. The smell pulled her toward the counter where 2 mugs were already set out. One labeled CEO of everything, and the other simply, try me. She took the second one. She sat at the small kitchen table sipping slowly, her mind trying to make sense of the past 24 hours. It all felt surreal. Being kicked out of the only home she had ever known, the humiliation, the fear. Then suddenly, Aaron, his calm voice, his strange timing, his offer to help. Could she really trust him? The door clicked behind her as she sipped. She turned to see Aaron walking in with a paper bag in hand. Good morning, he said. How's Eli? Better, she said, standing. He's still asleep, but the fever's gone. Thank you, it's for everything. He set the bag down and pulled out a small bottle of children's fever reducer and 2 bananas. Didn't know what he liked, but figured this might help if it comes back. She stared at the items in silence for a moment, her throat tightening again. No one's done anything like this for us. Not in years. Aaron shrugged slightly. You shouldn't have had to go through this alone in the first place. They sat across from each other. The atmosphere was different now, less like strangers, more like people who had survived the same fire and realized they still had smoke in their lungs. I've been thinking, Aaron said, pulling out his phone. There's something I want to show you. He turned the screen toward her. It was an old photograph, black and white, slightly blurry. A group of employees standing outside a construction site, all smiling. She gasped. That's my dad, she whispered. That's me. I was 6. You were climbing the scaffolding like it was a jungle gym, Aaron said with a soft laugh. Your dad used to bring you by every Friday afternoon. The whole office knew who you were. She leaned in closer. She hadn't seen that photo in years, hadn't even known one existed. Where did you get this? She asked. My dad kept old archives. When he died, I saved some. Thought it might matter someday. Didn't know how much until now. Grace felt something shift in her. This wasn't charity. This wasn't pity. Aaron knew her story because, somehow, he had always been just a few pages away from it. He tapped the screen and opened another file. This time, a scanned document. I had my legal team pull your father's old will. Before the accident. Before Paul got guardianship. She tensed. Is that even legal? It's public record, he said gently. I needed to see something. He rotated the phone so she could read the lines. In the event of my incapacity, I grant full authority to my daughter, Grace Carter, to manage my estate and affairs, as she has always been my greatest responsibility and pride. Her hand flew to her mouth. He named me, she whispered. He chose me. Aaron nodded. That document was never submitted to the courts after the accident. Paul moved fast, probably had his own lawyer bury it, but it still exists, which means we have a case. Tears welled in her eyes. Aaron didn't push. He waited. Grace looked at the photo again, her tiny 6-year-old self in overalls, smiling up at the man who, Even now, she struggled to recognize in his current state. He wouldn't want this, she said quietly. To forget me. To let someone else erase everything we were. Aaron reached across the table and gently placed his hand over hers. Then let's remind them who you are. The hearing was scheduled for Wednesday morning. Grace spent the 2 days leading up to it alternating between anxiety and disbelief. Part of her couldn't believe any of this was real. Aaron's help, the recovered will, the sudden possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could reclaim what had been stolen from her. But another part of her was terrified. What if it wasn't enough? What if the judge sided with Paul? What if they said the will was outdated or invalid or worse, meaningless? Aaron didn't waver. He arranged everything. An attorney from his own legal team, a family law specialist with a reputation for integrity. Her name was Vanessa Liu, and she spoke to Grace on the phone the night before court. You're going to be fine, Miss, Vanessa had said. Just tell the truth. We have the documents, the statements, and the timeline. Let them try to twist it. We'll be ready. Still, Grace didn't sleep that night. She sat beside Eli, watching his little chest rise and fall. He'd woken earlier, asking if they were going home soon. She didn't know how to answer him, so she had just nodded and kissed his forehead. By morning, she was pale and quiet, dressed in clean but simple clothes Aaron had helped her buy from a nearby department store. When she entered the courthouse holding Eli's hand, her heart was pounding so loudly it felt like it echoed in her ears. Paul was already there, standing smugly near his attorney. He didn't even look at her. Her father Thomas sat beside him, wearing a worn-out suit, blank-eyed, staring ahead like he didn't understand why he was even there. Grace had to look away. Seeing him like that crushed her. The courtroom was small and quiet. The judge, a gray-haired woman with sharp eyes, looked at the files in front of her and motioned for the proceedings to begin. Vanessa rose first. Your Honor, she said clearly, we are here to challenge the existing guardianship and housing rights granted to Mr. Paul Carter on the basis of a previously unrevealed legal document, Mr. Thomas Carter's last valid will, which designates his daughter, Grace Carter, as his primary agent and legal representative in the event of medical incapacitation. She handed the will to the court clerk. Paul's attorney objected almost immediately. This document was never submitted, never notarized in the appropriate timeline, and cannot be authenticated without the testator's confirmation. Vanessa didn't flinch. Your Honor, we have metadata showing the document's date of origin, matching Thomas Carter's former attorney's archives. Furthermore, we have a sworn statement from a witness present when it was signed. She stepped aside, and to Grace's surprise, Aaron stood up and took the witness stand. He introduced himself, explained his connection to the Carter family, described seeing the will back when Thomas had brought Grace to the office. His voice was calm, authoritative, without exaggeration. He loved her, Aaron said, glancing at Grace only once. He said she was the only person he trusted to take care of him if things ever went wrong. Paul shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The judge reviewed the documents carefully. Then she turned to Grace. Ms. Carter, would you like to speak? Grace stood slowly. Her knees trembled, but her voice, though soft, did not break. I took care of my dad for almost 2 years after the accident, she said. He changed, yes, but he never stopped being my father. I stayed because I thought love was enough. Then I was told I didn't belong anymore, that I had no right to be in my own home. My son and I were thrown out in the rain, and I didn't have anything left to prove I deserved to stay. She paused, tears in her eyes. But I was never trying to take anything from anyone. I was just trying to hold on to the last piece of the man who raised me. The courtroom was silent. After a long moment, the judge folded her hands and said, I've reviewed the evidence and considered the circumstances. It's clear that Grace Carter was not only designated in the will, but acted in good faith to care for her father when others did not. I am granting her joint guardianship with review in 60 days. Grace didn't move. It took her a full 5 seconds to realize what had been said. She won. Paul muttered something under his breath and stormed out. Thomas didn't react. He just sat there, lost in whatever fog had swallowed his memories. Grace sat down slowly, as if afraid it might all vanish if she moved too quickly. Aaron leaned toward her, his voice barely above a whisper. You did it. She nodded once, unable to speak. But in her heart, for the first time in what felt like forever, a door had opened. The days following the court hearing moved with strange stillness, like the world was waiting to see if the decision would hold. Grace and Eli returned not to the shelter, but to a small, sunlit apartment arranged by Aaron's foundation. Temporary housing while the legal paperwork was finalized. It wasn't home, but it was warm, clean, safe. There was a little kitchen where Eli sat on the counter while Grace made him scrambled eggs in the morning, and a tiny living room where she could finally exhale. She spent her days sorting through paperwork with Vanessa, filling out forms, and preparing to gradually return to the house where she had grown up. The court had allowed her back under monitored conditions, with a court liaison scheduled to visit weekly. Paul hadn't contested the arrangement. He disappeared after the hearing, leaving behind only a bitter trail of silence. No one seemed eager to find him. What shocked Grace most wasn't how quickly her circumstances changed. It was how quiet the change felt. There was no dramatic music, no fireworks. Just slow mornings, soft evenings, and the feeling of her body finally learning to relax after being locked in survival mode for years. Aaron visited often, but never without texting first, never intruding. Sometimes he brought books for Eli, or groceries she didn't ask for but was grateful to receive. Sometimes he stayed to drink tea and talk. Other times he just left things by the door and waved from the hall. One evening, after Eli had gone to sleep, Grace sat curled up on the couch with her knees pulled to her chest, staring out the window at the amber light of the street lamp outside. The quiet was deafening. For years, her life had been noise. Arguments, sirens, slammed doors, unanswered calls. Now it was just her and her thoughts, and they were louder than anything. A knock at the door broke the silence. When she opened it, Aaron stood there holding a plain envelope in his hand. "I wasn't sure if I should bring this," he said, "but it's yours." She looked at him, puzzled, and took the envelope. Inside was a photograph, an old one. It was her and her father. She couldn't have been more than 10. They were standing in the backyard, her on his shoulders, both of them laughing. She ran her fingers over it like it might crumble from age. "I found it in a storage box my dad kept from your father's old office," Aaron said quietly. "I thought you should have it." Grace didn't speak for a long moment. Her throat tightened. "You've done too much already," she said softly, not accusing, but full of something raw and hesitant. Aaron looked at her, really looked. "I haven't done nearly enough," he replied. Then he added, "But I'll stop if you want me to." That sentence sat between them like a fragile truth. She stepped aside to let him in. They sat across from each other on the floor, backs against the couch, sharing tea and not pretending to have the answers. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then she broke the silence. "Do you think he'll ever come back?" Aaron turned his head toward her. "Your father?" She nodded. He thought for a moment. "Maybe not all the way, but I think pieces of him are still there. I've seen it happen." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "What if I'm not strong enough to wait?" He didn't answer right away. Then quietly, "Then let someone wait with you." She looked at him, and something in her chest cracked open. Something she had buried years ago under duty and pain and fear. She didn't reach for his hand. She didn't need to. The space between them had already changed. Later that night, after Aaron left and the apartment was quiet again, Grace stood by Eli's bed and watched him sleep. He looked peaceful, the kind of peace children shouldn't have to fight for. She brushed a curl from his forehead and kissed his cheek. "We're going home soon," she whispered. And for the first time in her life, she knew what home meant. It wasn't just a house, it was a choice, a future, a new beginning, and it was almost within reach. The day Grace returned to her childhood home, the sky was overcast but calm. There was no rain, no thunder, just the hush of early spring and the quiet of a neighborhood that hadn't seen her in months. Eli held her hand tightly as they stepped up onto the front porch, the old wooden boards groaning softly beneath their feet. She paused before unlocking the door, the weight of memory pressing heavily on her chest. The lock clicked open. The scent hit her first. Faint traces of old wood, dust, and something warm she couldn't name. Home. Everything was just as she remembered it, and nothing like it at all. The pictures were still on the walls. The worn sofa still sagged in the middle, and her mother's wind chimes still hung by the back door, though they no longer sang. She walked slowly from room to room, Eli at her side, touching surfaces gently, as if afraid they might vanish. When they reached the kitchen, she dropped her keys on the counter and turned to him with a trembling smile. "This was where Grandpa used to make pancakes," she said. "They were always a little burnt, but I loved them anyway." Eli climbed onto a chair and looked around wide-eyed. "Can we make pancakes too?" Grace laughed softly, brushing tears from her cheeks. "We can try." Later that afternoon, she unpacked the box of things she'd saved from the apartment: Eli's drawings, a faded blanket, the photo Aaron had given her. She placed it on the mantel carefully, next to an older picture of her father smiling at a company picnic. Two versions of the same man. Both loved her. One still might, somewhere deep inside. As she was finishing, she heard the front door open. Aaron stepped in, holding a brown paper bag in one hand and 2 cups of coffee in the other. He looked around the space, then at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. "I brought breakfast," he said. "Technically lunch now, but I didn't want you to be alone today." She reached for one of the cups and gave him a tired smile. "I'm glad you're here." They sat at the kitchen table, just like she used to with her dad. The silence between them was full of things they didn't need to say. There was no rush anymore, no pressure, just shared space and mutual understanding. After a while, Aaron leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Do you know what you want to do next?" he asked. She looked out the window for a long moment. The backyard was wild with weeds, the garden unkempt, but she could see possibility there. Beneath the mess, something still lived. "I want to fix this place," she said. "Not just the walls, everything. Make it safe again. Not just for me, for Eli, for Dad, if he ever—" She trailed off. Aaron nodded. "Then we'll do that?" She looked at him. "We?" He smiled slightly. "If you'll have me." Grace didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood and walked to the back door, opening it. The wind chimes stirred gently in the breeze, just enough to give a faint, familiar note. She turned to him, her voice steady. "I think I want you here." He stood and joined her, their shoulders brushing as they looked out into the backyard. A few days later, Grace invited a nurse to evaluate her father's condition in the assisted care facility. The visit wasn't easy. He still didn't recognize her, not always. But that day, when Eli ran into the room and hugged him without fear, something flickered in Thomas's expression. A softness. His eyes grew wet. He didn't speak, but his hand moved, slowly, deliberately, to rest on Eli's shoulder. That was enough. Grace left with Eli in one hand and a folder of updated health records in the other. The nurse had said there were good days and bad days ahead, but there was progress. And where there was progress, there was hope. That night, back in the house that was finally theirs again, Grace stood in the doorway of Eli's room, watching him sleep beneath clean sheets and a full belly. Then she walked into the living room, where Aaron was reading by the lamp, glasses sliding down his nose. She sat beside him without a word, resting her head on his shoulder. For the first time in years, she wasn't surviving. She was living. And that changed everything. As the author of this story, I believe the ending carries the emotional resolution the journey deserved. Grace's path was never about sudden miracles. It was about quiet strength, dignity in the face of abandonment, and the resilience that so many women like her demonstrate every day without recognition. The fact that she found a way back home, physically, emotionally, and generationally, feels earned, not handed. Eli's peaceful sleep, her father's flicker of memory, and Aaron's steady presence aren't grand gestures. They are the deeply human answers to deep human pain. This isn't a fantasy where everything becomes perfect. It's a hopeful truth that with support, love, and courage, healing is possible. The ending doesn't scream, it breathes. And in that breath, Grace finally lives, not just survives. That, to me, is the most powerful triumph of all.